Once again, welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome a new contributor to this week's program. Her name is Kim-Leigh Tursi. And Kim, I welcome you to the show. First of all, I know you're a Young Voices contributor, but tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Of course. So I recently graduated in 2023, and I'm now based out of Wilmington, Delaware, working in the financial services industry. But on the side, I'm excited to have become a Young Voices contributor to write about my interests in business and technology.
And what a great article I'm looking at that you wrote for freethepeople.org. The title is "The U.S. Attracts Top Foreign Talent and Tells the Unlucky Ones to Go Away." And I guess if people aren't familiar with what it takes to gain a visa to work here in the country, they might not be aware of some of the pitfalls as well as some of the advantages. Set the stage for us, if you would. There was a court decision earlier this month that affirmed that spouses of H-1B visa workers can work while they wait for their green card. Now, you say that's good news for the circumstances, but the fact it was ever in jeopardy shows that there's some backward thinking going on here. Why is that?
Right, because a lot of people are not welcoming to U.S. foreign talent, and it's a very complex situation. I wasn't even aware of it myself until I was chatting with some really talented coworkers over lunch, and they informed me that they were very insecure about their ability to stay in the U.S. And I said, "What do you mean? You have a job at a top US company who's already willing to sponsor you?" And they said, "Oh, if only it were that simple." So for context, the H-1B visa program was started through the Immigration Act of 1990. And in 2004, Congress established a cap on the amount of H-1B visas that were issued. So there are 65,000 H-1B visas for specialty occupations. So that would be foreign talent that has some type of unique skill set that is not able to be met by domestic labor force. And there are an extra 20,000 reserved for those with advanced master's degrees and higher. But in 2014, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services introduced a lottery system to manage the H-1B visa demand that had consistently exceeded those caps. So 10 years later, here we are, and the application volume for H-1B visas is double that of 2014, and there are still no changes to the situation, and it's become increasingly dire, as you can imagine.
I have to admit, those numbers are considerably higher than what I would have expected. I don't know how many people I was expecting that would come here from other countries to work. I know that there's pushback too, and maybe it's because it's an election year and immigration is playing a big role, but there's a perception out there that, well, when foreign workers come over here, they steal jobs from Americans. And you kind of put that rumor or that myth to rest and say that, no, they don't detract from the economy.
Right. I think there's multiple parts to this. One is that the H-1B visa program is specifically designed to prevent against the whole myth of foreign laborers stealing domestic jobs and pushing down wages. So the Immigration and Nationality Act expressly requires employers sponsoring a foreign worker to prove that there are not already sufficient workers who are able, willing, and qualified to fill a position, and that employment of a foreign worker will not adversely affect the wages and working conditions of domestic workers in the U.S. And we see from various studies and reports from the National Bureau of Economic Research that immigrants have really contributed to our economy. They represent only 16% of all U.S. inventors, but they produce 23% of total innovation output. And to just give more of an insight into the sizing of this population, in recent estimates, about 19% of STEM workers in the U.S. were foreign born. So that's a little over 7 million employees.
So we're not talking about, entry-level jobs and they're coming in here to do low-ball, sub-minimum wage type of work. This sounds like very skilled work, and yet a good portion of the people who come here and apply for these visas still, there's kind of a luck of the draw situation. Why is it so many of them are left hanging?
I honestly couldn't tell you. I think it's about a government that's prioritizing the idea and maintaining arbitrary quotas based on, people's fears that aren't true, that they'll steal jobs and push down wages. But I think it's important that we ensure access to external talent where it's needed. And clearly, it's very, very needed. In the recent application cycle for fiscal year 2025 alone, over 470,000 applicants submitted eligible registrations and entered this H-1B visa lottery, but only a bit under 121,000 were actually selected to receive the H-1B visa.
Wow. And I love that you point out here, this is not a matter of, again, people coming here to take advantage of, companies that are, wanting to just pay a rock bottom wage. This is innovation. And I guess another way to put it, sometimes it's good to bring in minds, that are bringing a slightly different perspective when it comes to solving problems. You mentioned that particularly in computers, communications, drugs and medical, electronics, chemical sectors, and so forth, this is where a lot of these workers come to contribute.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And even in my own experience working with coworkers who may have come from other countries but got their advanced degrees in the US, these are highly talented individuals. And I just feel so sympathetic toward their situation because they've really proved to be a valuable part of the workforce. We rely on them. If they are not able to stay, then that really does create a problem that I even see in my day-to-day.
So what, in the interest of reform, what is something that could be done on the part of, let's just say with the Department of Labor? What kind of actions could they take to help rectify this situation?
Mm-hmm. I think the main thing is simple. It's to expand the number of H-1B visas that they are issuing at the bare minimum to meet the demand that companies are requiring. And we need to first get rid of the H-1B lottery to do that.
Who is going to oppose that? I'm curious, is it labor unions? Who is going to be most likely to say, oh, we don't want to see that go away?
That's a tough one.
Or is it just American workers who have bought into the myth that, hey, these people are coming to take our jobs?
Yeah. I think public sentiment is still strong. And obviously wanting to provide for their own families and take care of their own fellow countrymen first is very understandable. But at the end of the day, these narratives that they're promoting are not true. And we need to work for a solution that is beneficial to the country. And that means getting rid of the lottery and expanding the H-1B visa program.
So ultimately, when that change comes, is it Congress that has to make that happen, or is that simply done under the regulatory authority of, for instance, the Department of Labor?
It would have to be voted in through Congress. So I believe that it really starts with the public and educating people on the situation.
Okay. Well, this is an issue. I wasn't even aware of it until I read your wonderful article. Now that I'm aware of it, this one's on my radar screen, and I'll be paying much closer attention to see how this shakes out in the future. Again, we are talking with Kim-Leigh Tursi. She is a Young Voices contributor. And Kim, for people who want to further follow your work or would like to follow you on social media, what's the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, so if you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is Kim-Leigh Tursi, K-I-M-I-T-U-R-S-I. But thank you so much, Brian, for having me today. It's been an honor.
Thank you. We'll be back with our second segment of today's show in just a few moments. Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome Alex Xenos back to the show. Alex is an attorney as well as a Young Voices contributor. And Alex, I'd like you, for the sake of people meeting you for the first time, fill in a few blanks for us and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. So my other hat besides writing is being a lawyer, but I'm definitely not your typical lawyer. I currently serve as counsel for a nonprofit, nonpartisan whistleblower organization that works with and represents insiders who report misconduct. So it involves a lot of FOIA work and nitty-gritty legal work, but also a lot of messaging. But I really see my career as one dedicated to both public service and the cause of liberty. And so a lot of my work falls outside of what you would see from a traditional lawyer as a traditional law firm. And I see my writing, especially that with Young Voices, as part of that.
Well, I'm looking at an excellent article that you wrote for Real Clear Politics about the Electoral College. And I guess being an election year, and particularly a contentious election year, I'm hearing some grumbling about the Electoral College. And you point out that there are some people actually saying that the Electoral College is just a relic of slavery. Why would they say something like that?
Yeah, well, just to introduce the context of the topic, the Electoral College really became much more of a prominent topic of discussion and a target of the left after the 2000 election, where for the first time in a very, very long time, the loser of the popular vote nonetheless won the election. And, obviously that was a controversial election, which came down to Florida. It was insanely close, and it got thrown to the Supreme Court. Anyway, the intricate details are neither here nor there. It's the fact that the Democrat lost while still won the popular vote that led to this focus being put on Electoral College. And so the first line of attack has been very simply, it's anti-democratic because it doesn't follow the overall popular vote of the entire nation. But the second line of attack, which you alluded to, is that, well, really, this is really just a racist message of slavery, and that it was created to protect slavery. And so those two go hand in hand. We have this anti-democratic message of slavery, so let's get rid of it. Now, actually, after Obama comfortably won in 08 and 12, a lot of attacks kind of died down a little bit. And you also saw some corners of the left where they felt more comfortable because of this blue wall they were supposed to have. But then after 2016, Trump won while losing the popular vote again. But this time, living in our new brave new woke world, the attacks have gone on steroids.
So let's delve into the history of the Electoral College. I know it's not well understood, and people, well, why wouldn't we go with the popular vote? Obviously, the founders had something in mind when they differentiated between the way that members of the House of Representatives would be elected, the way that senators would be elected, and the way that the president would be elected.
Right. So the Electoral College was the result of a compromise at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 based on the need to ensure the states had a say in choosing the president. That is true with or without slavery. And I do agree with scholars like Akil Amar, who argue that slavery was a major dividing point between the states. But where people go wrong is in making the massive leap that the only reason the college was created was to protect slavery, and that is just wrong. There was never going to be enough support for a direct popular election. Even for a while after the Constitution was ratified, the states themselves didn't even hold a direct popular election for president. Moreover, nothing in the Electoral College system inherently favored slavery. So you could have had a system like the Electoral College that did not count slaves as part of the population for purposes of distributing electors. So it was really the counting of slaves and proportioning electors via the infamous 3/5 clause that protected slavery, not the system itself. And, like I said, the states would never have agreed to a method of electing president that stripped them of having a say in the matter. So protecting state sovereignty and ensuring less populous states had influence were key features of the compromise.
I wonder why it's so poorly understood. And I'm saying that as someone who really didn't understand much about the hows and whys of the Electoral College just until, the last few years. But why is it that most of the public has trouble getting their mind around it?
Well, I think it's because there's been a concerted effort to suggest the contrary, to suggest talking points, like I said, about slavery. And it's easy to do once you start conflating that, well, slavery was an issue and it was dividing point between the states. We can just conflate it all, right? Because even like I said, even people like Akil Amar and these other scholars, they're even conflating them. They even almost admit that they're conflating it by saying, "Oh, well, this is a major dividing point between the states." But then then they make this giant leap forward that, well, that's the primary cause, Electoral College. But it's really just politics. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the analogies that a friend used to help me get this was, he said, well, do you ever watch the World Series? And I'm like, well, yeah. And he says, so why doesn't the team who scores the most home runs or the most runs, why don't they win the World Series? And it's like, well, they have to win the majority of the games. And he says, exactly. In other words, the number of points scored doesn't matter as much as the number of games won. And with that, it was like, oh, okay, well, this kind of makes sense. Now, using this, to point out, populous states would dominate everything, in the country if it was strictly done on the popular vote alone. So to me, that seems like a very far-sighted approach that the founders took. Although, as you point out in your article, it wasn't exactly a slam dunk. It wasn't like they all just nodded their heads in agreement. They had to kind of suss it out.
Mm-hmm. Right. So moving, to the merits in this democracy critique that you hear. For me, the strengths of Electoral College are really the geographic and state representation and respect for state sovereignty. But there are additional benefits too. So number one, in a national election in a country as large and diverse as ours, representation based on geographic segments of the population is going to be far superior to the model of a purely popular vote. We are not a monolithic society. Life and perspectives vary based on location. This is especially true when you consider the differences between state governments, which attract different types of people. California and Florida are not the same. And, double clicking on this type of representation, we see a further benefit. America is an enormous nation, and a system based solely on a popular vote would allow densely populated cities and states to dominate, like you were alluding to. And so this dynamic, I think, is particularly problematic when one considers that urban populations often want to oppose their culture and policy preferences on others, whereas rural populations generally want to be left alone. And, we can see this in how our politics run about. Just think about how Democrats are constantly trying to center things in Washington. They want everything to be regulated by the feds. But I think regardless of this left versus right paradigm, it's simply going to be better to give different geographic elements of the nation and the states a voice on national matters to somewhat lessen the ability of the majority to steamroll political minorities.
Right. And actually a good example of this would be some of the fervor that we're seeing right now over the topic of abortion since the overturn of Roe v. Wade a couple of years ago. All it did was return that decision to the states, but there are people who are like, no, we need one size fits all, and it has to come from the federal level. But even, for instance, Trump and Vance on the Republican side have said if they were presented with a nationwide or a federal ban on abortion, it wouldn't be right. It needs to be up to the states.
Right. And I think a lot of this is instigated by hostility towards the federal system to begin with. I mean, if it was up to the left, there would be no states, right? So it really goes against our entire system to get rid of the Electoral College. The states are separate sovereign. We want people to decide based on those federal principles. And like we said, even the Electoral College even affects how our politics, presidential campaigns work out. And also addressing the democracy point, American government was never meant to be just a democracy. It's just meant to be a component of our constitutional republic.
I think that may be the most powerful line in the whole article, and I'm so glad you said it. Some people's heads will explode. What? America was never meant to be a democracy, but you point out the protection of liberty and the rights of the individuals actually are more important than the ability of the majority to impose their will. And, I wish more people understood that.
Right, absolutely. And this is kind of overplayed on the right about between the left and right about, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And all that's really meant by is that the core component of American government is not democracy. That's all somebody like me is trying to say. It's not saying that democracy is not important. It's not saying that people shouldn't vote or anything. It's saying that our rights come first.
Again, we are talking with Alex Xenos. He is a Young Voices contributor. Alex, where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter or X at AMXenos. That's AMXENOS. And I also have a Substack that I mainly use to alert people to articles I'm having.
And we are back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, I'm very happy to introduce our next contributor. His name is Niklas Kleinworth. Now, I know Niklas from some other settings. He works with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. I do some work for them as well. But Niklas is a Young Voices contributor. It's good to catch up with you in this vein. And for those meeting you for the first time, take a minute, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, thanks, Brian, for having me on. I'm the policy director, actually, for the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and that means that I deal with quite a lot of different policy issues. But healthcare is a special issue that's near and dear to my heart, something I specialize in, and so I was happy to come on the show and talk about that today.
Yeah, I'm looking at the title of this piece that you've written, Unraveling the Doomsday Narrative on Medicaid. And I guess I don't get out of my bubble often enough, but I didn't know there was a doomsday narrative. Tell me about it. Where does that come from?
Well, so it actually stems from COVID policies, actually. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, Congress was giving states more money to keep ineligible people on the Medicaid rolls. So the states weren't allowed to clean the rules off and make sure that only people who should be on Medicaid are on the program. And then, of course, within the last year, all that expired. And so now states were finally able to start removing ineligible people from their rolls. But there was this narrative surrounding the whole thing that we shouldn't be removing these people from the rolls because everyone's going to be uninsured. We're going to just leave these people on the street completely without help. And as we're finding from the data, that just wasn't the case.
So when they talk about how there was going to be, a lot of people left uninsured, what kind of numbers are we talking?
We're talking millions of people. So they were projecting about 3.8 million people were going to be uninsured. And keep in mind that we were talking about almost 18 million people would be disenrolled. We were looking at about 18 million people who were ineligible to be on Medicaid that would be removed from the program. And so they were projecting about almost 4 million people, 3.8 million people we're going to be left without insurance entirely. But what we're finding actually is that the number was quite lower. It's about 2 million people lower than expected. And what's even more impressive about that is we actually disenrolled more people than we expected to. There were about 39% more people who needed to be removed from the rolls, who were ineligible to be on Medicaid. So we have these lower numbers despite having to cut more people from the program.
And I just want to make it clear, when we talk about disenrolling, this doesn't mean they were kicked to the curb and, well, good luck. Ayn Rand wishes you're on your own here. We're talking about people who were able to land on their feet. And in other words, they weren't left in a terrible situation. They just didn't need to be on Medicaid any longer.
Exactly. And actually, what they projected was that fewer than 1% of all the people who were disenrolled would actually not have any options when they get off the program. And so we're talking about options like employer-sponsored coverage. If we're talking about children, there's children health insurance programs. And then there's also the Obamacare exchanges as well that are heavily subsidized. So people who are really close to the line generally actually may not qualify for Medicaid, but end up qualifying for different things. So even though we're talking about getting people off the Medicaid program, there are a lot of options for these people that were made available.
So what are some of the better options that have emerged in the meantime? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm looking at like things like Obamacare, and I remember they talked about it in such flowery language. Oh, it's going to be great, and you can keep your doctor, and you go into the insurance marketplace, and let's just say I'm not a fan. But I understand that there are some viable options out there. So tell me about some of the positive things that came out of this in terms of what people were able to access.
Yeah, well, and keep in mind that once people were getting off of these programs and off them, it opens up the free market as well. So now employers are looking at this and going, oh, there's an opportunity in this employment shortage, by the way, where employers are clamoring to try and get people to come work for them to offer better benefits. And so you can go and get your employer-sponsored coverage. when you get off of the Medicaid program. And truthfully, the Obamacare exchanges, they're not great, but they're significantly cheaper than putting somebody on a Medicaid program. And at least you have that stake you have that skin in the game when you go into the doctor's office, where you do have to still pay co-pays. And in a lot of cases, you still have to pay some sort of a premium. And so you're not just leaving these people on this government welfare system, but you're kind of giving them an off ramp to get off the program and be self-sufficient.
And I know that I'm sure there's a lot of compassion at play when people are like, well, look, once we got them on Medicaid, it's probably best if we just keep them on there. But you make a very strong case here that retaining people on Medicaid who don't really need to be on it isn't really doing them a favor in the long run. Why is that?
Well, it's terrible, actually. And I think that the real threat to this COVID era policy was that it was really a single payer healthcare system light. I think the bureaucrats really wanted to just keep this going on forever, as many temporary government programs go, and then continue to grow it, where more and more people who probably shouldn't be on the program end up staying on the program. But here's the real cost of this. It costs nearly $82 billion per year to keep all those ineligible people on the roll. Insurance companies were still getting their payments for the people being on the rolls, even though the people weren't using the services. And in fact, they're finding now that millions of Americans didn't even know they were on Medicaid. They thought that they were off the rolls and went and got their own coverage and did their own thing, only to find out later that, oh, well, I was on a government system the whole time. They were paying for me to be on the system, but I had no idea. And so the benefit here is that now that people are off the rolls, the taxpayer can be relieved of that $82 billion burden. And these people can start being self-sufficient. They have wider access to networks. Medicaid coverage isn't very good in general. Fewer and fewer physicians are taking Medicaid because of the payment system and having to deal with the government and all the regulations that come with it. And so I think that overall, getting fewer people on the system is helping the healthcare system overall.
I'm happy to hear you address, the taxpayer who's left on the hook, for these people who maybe not even know that they have that coverage. I know there seems to be kind of a mindset sometimes in some corners of government. Wow, but the taxpayers will pick it up. Somehow apportioning that pain out over, a large number of people is supposed to make it right. But it still takes an awful lot of productivity and the time and money that has been earned by these people and squanders it.
Certainly. And keep in mind that these welfare programs, what's been shocking about this election cycle is there's really very little discussion about things like the debt. Every citizen in this country, if you were to take the debt and split it up between everybody, you're still looking at just over $101,000 per person to try and pay off this debt. And so as you continue to have more and more programs that the government can't really pay for but keeps promising, like Medicaid, it's just going to accelerate that problem.
Well, it's good to see that there are states that are taking this seriously. Let's talk about, we've got about 1 minute left here, Niklas. Talk to me about, are there states that have resisted taking ineligible enrollees off? And if so, what are the consequences for those states in terms of their own budgets?
Well, there are a few states. I look to Idaho's neighbor in Oregon as probably the most egregious example, actually. So instead of removing these people from the program, they actually just left them on the program and created a new category class for them. So really, it was Medicaid expansion 2.0, where these people were allowed to stay. And it's going to cost them substantially over time. And you have a system where the government's going to have a harder time paying for these services. But don't worry, the federal government is still covering the share of those people at roughly 90% of the cost. So the state has no stake in the game, but you and I over here in Idaho do. And so really Congress should probably think about addressing these states that are abusing the program.
Again, we're talking with Niklas Kleinworth. He's the policy director at Idaho Freedom Foundation and a Young Voices contributor. Where can people find you on social media?
Yes, you can follow me on X at @nkleinworth.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment of today's show. I'm happy to welcome back to the program Iulia Lupse. So good to have you back on the show. For people who are meeting you for the first time, Iulia, tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm originally from Romania, but based in New York. I've worked in news media and on political campaigns in the past. Now I'm freelancing full-time, helping clients with their communication needs. And on a more personal level, I'm enjoying exploring topics, whether domestic or international, that often don't get the attention they deserve in the mainstream media.
And that's exactly what we get to discuss today, a topic which I wish more people knew about. I was not aware of Maria Oropeza until, a couple of episodes ago. And it was a Young Voices contributor who brought her to my attention. But this is a Venezuelan activist who was arrested. And as far as I know, I guess I'm going to ask you for the update. She is still being held by the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Tell me a little bit about her situation. In fact, a little bit of background for people who may not be familiar with Maria. What is her story?
Yes, so Maria Oropeza, she's a 30-year-old Venezuelan activist and lawyer who was arrested on August 6th by agents from Venezuela's General Directorate of Military Counterintelligence. So basically Maduro's security forces. And what makes this arrest stand out is that it happened while she was live streaming from her home. So you got to see in real time how these agents stormed in and arrested her before the live stream went dark. You could see and hear, I believe, at least 4 security agents continuously hitting a gated door that was at the bottom of a couple of stairs from the entrance to her home. And at one point, you could even hear her saying that they're entering her home arbitrarily and there's no search warrant. They arrested her without any legal justification, and she hasn't been heard from since.
And the point in your article is that she knew she was being targeted, but
yes. So Maria, she's not just any activist. She's part of Vente Venezuela, which is an opposition party led by Maria Corina Machado. And Maria was pretty successful in mobilizing people, especially in Portuguesa state, which is a rural state that's considered the breadbasket of Venezuela. She was very vocal about the Maduro regime's tactics online as well. I believe that on the day of her arrest, before she was arrested, she posted on X about an operation called Tuntun, which in English translates to Operation Knock Knock, which essentially allows Maduro security forces to arrest political opponents without warrants. So they show up at your door, they knock, and they take you away in the middle of the night, so to speak. And she was aware that she was being targeted. I actually spoke to Agustina Sosa, she's a close friend of Maria's and the president of the Argentina chapter of the Ladies of Liberty Alliance, which is a network of independent and libertarian-minded women. And she had told me that Maria had actually been worried about something like this happening for a while. In fact, during a Lola retreat in Uruguay earlier this year, Maria specifically asked that no pictures of her be posted online because she knew the government was keeping an eye on her.
So in the time that she has been in their custody, which is, well over a month, coming up on almost 2 months now, has anyone heard from her?
From what I know so far, no. So when I talked to 3 of her friends back in, I believe, August, and I've been regularly searching for updates, haven't really found anything. Her mom hasn't heard from her either. She hadn't been charged at that point. It's possible that she's been charged by now. Her friends actually explain how political dissidents in Venezuela are usually charged with terrorism. So that means that she could face up to 30 years in prison. And what's even worse is she wouldn't be allowed to have her own lawyer. Maduro's government usually appoints lawyers in these cases who are loyal to the regime. So basically any trial Maria faces would be completely rigged against her.
I know in your article in Reason, you talk about how Maria's friend said Maria had the opportunity. She could have left Venezuela if she had wanted to, but she chose to stay. Talk to me about why she chose to stay.
I think she chose to stay. As anyone who, loves freedom, I think she thought it was important to go back and fight for her country. She actually was in the U.S. before, and she could have gotten refuge here, but she ended up going back. But I think it's because she realized that she could potentially be arrested. And her arrest, too, is part of a much broader and ongoing crackdown by the Maduro regime that's been going on for years, but especially following the contested presidential election back in late July. It was full of irregularities, and despite evidence that the opposition candidate received the most votes, the National Electoral Council, which is filled with loyalists, quickly declared Maduro the winner. Then even the State Department released a statement condemning the election process and declaring the opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez the rightful winner. But yeah, in response to that, Maduro's government started cracking down even harder, with over 2,000 people detained since the election, many of them activists, journalists, and opposition leaders.
Now, you point out in the article, too, that it's not enough that they would take these dissidents into custody, but it sounds like the Maduro regime also is releasing propaganda videos that are mocking them and inciting fear in the rest of the population, lest anyone else might want to speak out.
So actually, after Maria was taken into custody, the government shortly after posted an edited version of the live stream on her live stream on social media, with creepy music from A Nightmare on Elm Street playing in the background. And speaking to some of her friends, they described this as a very usual tactic of psychological warfare used by Maduro. So it's not just about silencing anyone who opposes him, but it's also about sending a message that if you dare oppose the government, you're next.
Scary stuff. So talk to me about some of the organizations that are working to not only raise awareness of Maria and her cause, but what are some of are there nations that have spoken out in her behalf as well?
So there's been a lot of articles written so far. No one's really spoken about her specifically, more generally about what's happening in Venezuela as a whole. But when it comes to a country like Venezuela with such a well-developed censorship machine, it's very hard to do much, at least on an individual level. And that's just the sad reality. Some human rights groups and organizations like Lola, for example, are working hard to secure Maria's release, even though, unfortunately, even they've said that it's probably in vain. That's why it's so important to bring attention to these issues. But what they've done is they filed a complaint with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, requesting precautionary measures to ensure her safety and demanding her immediate release. Unfortunately, we've seen with many authoritarian governments across the globe that human rights complaints often fall on deaf ears, even after there's growing international pressure, and it's still a long, hard battle. But for now, what we can do is bring attention to the issue.
Well, and maybe this sounds trite, but that's a powerful example that she's setting. And I think it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn who talked about how, to stand for truth is nothing. For truth, you must sit in jail. And this looks like an example of someone who is committed enough that unfortunately, it has cost her freedom in the short term, but I'm being optimistic and hoping that at some point the Maduro regime will relent and let her go. For people who are looking for more information on this, Iulia, where can they go? What are some of the reliable sources where they could learn more?
So Lola actually has a whole page dedicated to Maria. There's a GoFundMe that they started, not necessarily that money will be used to try to bring more attention to the issue, but it's also for her mother, who has been back and forth from Caracas and just trying to find where her daughter is, or find anything in relation to what might be happening. So I would definitely urge people to go to Lola's website and look at that page.
Again, we're talking with Iulia Lupse. Where can people find you on social media?
So I'm on X at Iulia L 27.